This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Hi folks, David here. If you've been listening closely, you might detect that the vibes, tone, and background noise in this episode are slightly different from more recent episodes. That's because this conversation was recorded back in summer of 2021. Without going into too much detail, we held off on posting this episode until now. For any potential future guests on This Restorative Justice Life, I want y'all to know that as much as I value sharing content with listeners, it's way more important to me to honor our relationship and your stories by not sharing until you're ready. It's just one of the ways that I try to live this restorative justice life. That being said, I'm super excited to be bringing this episode out of the vault. A few things we reference might seem out of date, but Eloise's stories and her experiences are so powerful, I can't wait for you to hear them. So let's get to it. Eloise, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am Eloise Reyes Sepeda, the daughter and granddaughter of Indigenous, Native, Spaniard, and Mexican American ancestors.
Who are you?
I am a wife, a mother, and the grandmother to a lineage of warriors.
Who are you?
I am she, her, Ea.
Who are you?
I am an extrovert, fierce, yet fragile.
Who are you?
I am someone who loves hard beyond my own understanding sometimes and ability to promote hate and unforgiveness, even when the world thinks I should.
Who are you?
I am someone who believes that equity in culture and music and food and colors and sound and laughter all have equal value in our world and in our communities and in the spaces that we're in.
And finally, who are you?
I am a little bit on the crazy side, which makes me unpredictable and a risk taker. I love the outdoors. I love the indoors. I love.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Eloise Sepeda as our guest today. Eloise is a strong survivor of domestic violence, gangs, drugs, homelessness, poverty, teen pregnancy, and dropping out of school. She has learned the power of holistic rescue, healing, and more with the support of the community and faith leaders. Eloise uses her professional and personal expertise to provide extensive training and implementation of trauma-informed RJ practices in a variety of different communities. This podcast does discuss themes of violence, and if that's not something you're looking to listen to today, there are many other ways to engage with Eloise's content, which can be found in the show notes below. Also in the show notes are links to all of Amplify RJ's social media platforms and links to our Future Ancestor Collective and all of our workshops and courses. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get back into the episode.
It is always good to check in. So, to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
How am I? It depends on the day.
Mm-hmm.
Some days I am plowing through and determined and on fire for change and equality and equity. And some days I'm tired and concerned and sad at the journey that the people before us have traveled and we are where we are. And so, how am I? I am a survivor who is striving to conquer every day that I have been blessed to live in the best way that I can,
Mm.
knowing that we're living through a pandemic and trying times, and just hoping to leave the best legacy that I can for those that are around me.
What has that looked like for you today?
How am I feeling today?
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Mm.
I am excited about um, this opportunity and being a guest on your podcast and listening to all of your work and seeing you make an impact. And I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is restorative justice and restorative practices.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that then, because, you've been doing this work for a minute now, probably before you knew the words restorative justice. So, in your own words, how did this journey get started for you?
I agree. Because it's a cultural practice of Indigenous people, and having Indigenous ancestors, and my grandmother, who is 100% Kickapoo, from Piedras Negras, and my grandfather being from Michoacan in Mexico, deep in the heart of the culture, and then her sitting us down as kids and just telling us stories. And then my other grandparents living to be 100 and 102, also just full of stories and experiences. I learned bits and pieces of history that are not in textbooks. And I also learned what it's like to listen. And I thought I was really good at it until I started getting my training and realized that I was not as good of a listener as I thought I was, and began to dive into learning how to be a better listener. So, in about 2010, I started walking alongside another practitioner and others in my community and really engaging on empowering community and community work. And we came across some material and some practices and relationships with others and began to enhance in training. And I realized during that time that I was either waiting for my turn to talk. By the time I was a child to an adult, that listening skill had shifted. And I was already thinking about something else, or because of also the shift in my mental health, my mind was wandering, or I was thinking about what else I had to do. In my life, I've been diagnosed with PTSD and ADHD and all the Ds. And it was a very critical time in my life that this took place. My daughter had some really difficult experiences and challenges with mental health and suicidal ideations, and I was scared. And having been a professional and a trainer and all of these other things, I really honed into the principles of the process and had to evaluate myself about where I had drifted, what I was doing, whether I was true, or whether I was just, or whether my responses were performative, or I was on autopilot. And so I really had to hone down on, was I listening to her? Was I being present with her? What's missing from this space? And I took her out of school and I dragged her into this community training that we were doing, and she had refused help. She had refused. She had stopped communicating with me and with others. And in this space and in the of training and community and hearing other communities talk about their challenges, she went from passing in every round to slowly starting to answer and slowly starting to respond. And that's when I saw the power of the process come to life in our own family. And I say it not only saved me, but it saved my daughter. And she began to open up, and she began to feel safe enough in the space that we had collectively created to share what her trials were, what her challenges were. And as a community, people began to come around her and encourage her and strategize with her about what she needed, what supports she needed, and what those outcomes were. And that took me back to the time in my life where I transitioned from the very rocky road that I was on and into my professional road. And it took me back. It took me back to the root of why I wanted to work with people and communities and provide help and resources.
Yeah. One of the things that I read on the internet about you, but I want to, clarify here, you were saying that like I was the at-risk kid, or I was the kid with at-risk behaviors that I advocate for today, right? I was traumatized at a young age and nobody asked those questions. No one was listening to you. Just a minute ago, you talked about how you had gone from this place of you were in this practice of listening to stories from elders and others, and you had transitioned to a place where you just wanted your voice to be heard. And I imagine that's because there were spaces in your life that also transitioned where your voice wasn't being listened to, right? I'm curious if there were some of those spaces that you wanted to share, and some of the journey that you went on between that childhood of listening and being listened to some of that rocky road.
Yeah. So as a child, we grew up in a home. My dad was a former Marine and very strict, very rough around the edges, and became an alcoholic. And so we grew our home transitioned from this safe home to an unsafe home. I grew up in a home of family violence. I literally remember seeing the violence, hearing the violence, running from the violence, pretending like I was asleep, crying and begging my mom to leave my dad. Like I just remember just crying and begging. And then while this was going on in our home, we lived in a community that was drastically changing as well. The crime rates were through the roof. It was very much became a very much a marginalized community. Black and brown families, gangs, drugs. We would hear helicopters and sirens and see the searchlights, and all of that became normalized for us. All of that became life as we know it. Our neighbors would have SWAT, or the other neighbors would be fighting. We learned how to fight to get to school. We learned how to fight to get home from school. So our life shifted from this very safe feeling to survival. And throughout that process, I took on a lot of responsibility to help my younger brother and my younger sister, because my dad did eventually leave and my mom took on multiple jobs, and did the very best with what she knew how. She taught us, she held on to those family values as much as possible. As time went on, because we were vulnerable and at risk, because my dad, when he left, he left, like he was out of the picture. And so we were fending for ourselves. And that was hard to talk about because that was a time where you didn't really talk about those things. And you were told what goes on in this house stays in this house. The threat or the fear of child welfare was real, or mental health. They're gonna, if you do this, they're gonna lock you up and put you in a padded room, or they're gonna take you away from us. And so we were conditioned to also not share. And so by conditioning, by us being conditioned, and when we condition our children to not share, we are silencing our children, and we're silencing ourselves. And so I, through as time went on and I got older, I mean, I got expelled from schools when my trauma was unleashed. I was brutally sexually assaulted by strangers and left on the side of the road for dead. And a neighbor found me. A neighbor who lived on our street was driving home and saw me laying in the grass on the side of the road. And so you'll often hear me say that community has always had community, because throughout that time, neighbors would bring over food, or part of our safety plan was to go to our neighbor's house, or to go to our grandma's house, or um, we would feed each other. I remember shared Thanksgiving meals and dinners, and I remember eating picnic style in the living room because our utilities were out. And I remember storing our food in the neighbor's refrigerator. And so as a community, while we saw itself burning itself down, we saw still the power of community holding it together the best we could with what we had. And so I moved around. I married, I became a teen mom at 16, and married my gangbanger boyfriend, who made me feel protected and safe, yet who became my biggest life threatening relationship as time went on. And I moved around. And when I came to the time and the place, two beautiful babies later, and living in Oak Cliff, Dallas, because we were constantly dragged into interrogation and kicked out of apartments, and just experiencing all of the outcomes of this lifestyle, a woman came to me and told me that God had a promise for me. And I didn't believe in God. I doubted the idea and the concept and the theory and everything about God, because all I could think about was, I haven't seen God. Where has he been in my life? And so this woman comes to me and tells me about God, and I cussed her out and shut the door.
Wait, so this is someone who just like came to the door randomly?
Came to the door randomly. And at the time, he's my ex-husband now, was in and out of prison. She knocks on the door and she says, I noticed you and your children out here. And so immediately, you know what, my brain does what it does, right? It's built, it's developed to guard and protect us. And I start thinking, nope, you're undercover, you're CPS, there's something in it, because nobody does anything nice for anybody without strings attached. And she says, nope, no strings attached. I just want to tell you that God has a plan for you. And she didn't know, and nobody knew. I didn't call home. I didn't reach out to my family, to my friends, to say, hey, I'm stuck. He's locked up again. I have almost no food. I was down to about 90 pounds. I'm 5'7", and I was weltering away. I was desperate. I was I was doing the hustle now. I was taking on that responsibility. I had dropped out of school. I just had my GED. I didn't have anything to stand on other than the street life that I knew. And so I said, okay, finally, I said, after a couple of weeks of her coming, regardless of how many times I slammed the door in her face, I said, does your God buy food? And she says, I'll be right back. And she brings food. And eventually, she invites me into her space. And she never, ever told me who she was. She was a pastor's wife. She had a whole congregation and resources and all of that. She never told me I was going to hell or I had to choose God or I had to do anything. I tell people to this day, she literally just loved the hell right out of me. I was not easy, not at all. And
Sorry, I just
that's,
got that. Hell. Oh, yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I hold that method of taking what she had, however little or much she could give, and however little or much I would receive, taking that to the street outside of the four walls. And I began to think, and I'll never forget, she told me on a sidewalk one day, I can remember it like yesterday. She says, do you want this life? At the time I only had my son and my daughter, and she says, do you want this life for your daughter? Do you want her to get the hell beat out of her every single day, or end up in prison, or in dead? And do you want your son to beat the hell out of someone every day, hold a gun to their head? All of those things were like normal to me. A gun, okay, I've seen guns my whole life. A knife to my throat, okay, you might kill me, you might not. And so all of these things were so normalized and I was so numb. But when she told me if that's what I wanted for my children, I said no, but I didn't know how to get out. And I didn't know what change looked like. I had never seen change in my life. I had never seen change in my parents. I hadn't seen change in my family. I hadn't seen change in my community. So to talk about what I wanted to do one day had never crossed my mind because I just needed to know I was going to get through that day. And she took me under her wing and she mentored me and she began to really help me to understand that I had more potential than what I believed I did. And when I came back to Austin, I was ready to leave. I needed to leave, or I was going to end up dead or in prison. And when I did leave, I again met the right people at the right time. And so throughout my journey, there's like these little drops from heaven of people that helped me. And I filed for my own divorce. I paid for my own fees. And while I was in court, an attorney stepped up because I didn't have anyone representing me, and my ex was in prison. And an attorney says, I'll help you. And the judge says, you know, recess, go help her get her paperwork right. I walked out of there with the lifetime protective order. I walked out of there with full custody of my children. I walked out of there with child support in place, even though I knew I was not going to get any money because he was always doing big time. And and so throughout my life, I've seen the right people at the right time. And it has shaped my process when I work with people or with community to even consider, if I'm in your life for this one day, if I can do for you in one day or point you in the right direction in one day, the way that the right people at the right time were there for me, then it's worth it. because I have a list of people that I look back and wish that I could find them and say, if you only knew what your seed or the drop of water on the seeds that were planted in me produced, it would give so much more people hope that people shouldn't be thrown away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Although I know you've shared it multiple times before, and I imagine it gets easier every time, but it's still not easy to relive. So thank you so much for sharing. I, Out of all of that, what stands out to me the most is the emphasis on community and relationships are what, you know, saved you, right? And literally saved your life in some ways, the lives of your children. And thinking about how that is the center of the work that we do, right? Around restorative justice, being in relationship, you were in conditions where you were isolated, right? Feeling isolated. You could have reached out to some different people. You didn't feel that you were in the space to for a number of reasons, ranging from shame, the frayed, strained relationships that you had with those. But it took somebody consistently showing up, right, and meeting material needs like feed my children, right, to be able to help make that shift for you. I'm curious how that transition led to you doing this work.
That transition led to me doing this work because when I came back, I had to go into a safe haven, which was underground housing,
Mm-hmm.
and to hide from my ex, who at that point wanted to kill me. And that's where I was honored to meet some of the people I would have never crossed paths with. I also believed that all white people hated us, people of color,
Mm-hmm.
or, and I had a prejudice against white people as well. And yet it was it was a white congregation who was putting their neck out there for me to hide me and my children. And by doing that, I was able to again share meals and time and space with doctors and lawyers and business owners, and where I just began to really see this sense of love and hope, and I think they had more hope for me than I did. And what I saw was, with the right people in our lives, we have access to more resources. And so there was this one person who had offered us help, and she invited me to a meeting, and it was with the Christian Counselors of Texas. And I was just like, I know this is a trick. Everything that was ever proposed to me was, my guard was up. I
Mm-hmm.
thought there were strings attached. And I said, okay, but I'll go. And when I went, um, in my mind, I went with the idea of, I've got to figure out why I'm crazy. I have to figure out why I'm crazy. And this was before I was diagnosed with PTSD. This was before I understood the complex, the different multi levels of complex trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to learn about why I was crazy, why I would fly off the handle, why I wanted to fight all the time. If somebody bumped me with the grocery basket, or, why my responses were just seemed so, now I know, irregulated. And so I went with the idea that I wanted to find out why I was crazy. And so I started listening, and I started going to more meetings, and I started learning about the brain, and I became interested with trauma. And I became interested in what trauma does to people, and then became interested in what causes trauma. And as you can imagine, there are all steps that is just unraveling, kind of like that box if you've ever, if your family is like mine, we play this joke like every couple of years where we wrap the big box and then there's a smaller box in it that's wrapped, and then a smaller box and then a smaller box. And that's what it was like, unraveling this from trauma to what causes it, to systems, to, and then I understood why I didn't call. And then I understood why I never reached out, why I never called law enforcement, why I never called the 800 number. And there was the gap. There was the cultural gap in those services. There was a gap of understanding in those services. And so, how that fast forwards into my work and into doing this work is really to bridge the gaps, is to help people to understand how to navigate those systems, and also how to help professionals in those systems to evaluate and to assess themselves individually as a provider, as a person, as the face of that organization or system, and then how to then in turn evaluate that agency or systems practices and policies. Is that resource accessible? You say it's available, but is it accessible to the people in a way that we will feel safe to accept, and to engage in resources? So I'll give you an example. Everyone talked about mental health over the last year of COVID, right? Understanding the gaps of why people of color refrain from quickly engaging in counseling is just the beginning of building those bridges with community. It's like saying, come in and talk to me, you can trust me, but I might report you while you're sharing. And so again, we're asking them to just trust systems, right? That have not been developed to support communities of color. So my hope is that by training professionals and training community and people, that we would learn how to co-design what those system approaches look like, and how we measure success is something else that I have challenged over the years. Of when you share your success rates, is that based on the outcome of a white family and that has access to resources and generational wealth, or a family of color who measures success on a completely different scale?
Yeah. What are some of the measures that you recommend? I also want to we haven't explicitly said what is it that you're doing, and where are you doing this? So if you want to share that and then talk about the ways that you help people think about measuring success.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I have co-authored curriculum for University of Texas in partnership with TEA, Texas Education Association, which oversees all of the schools in Texas. We implemented training and policy evaluation to implement restorative justice in schools or practices, training teachers how to keep kiddos in school to address disproportionality of Black and Brown students being disciplined at a higher rate. I've also co-authored curriculum with Texas State, who holds the contract for TCOL, which is training for law enforcement and restorative justice practices, how to engage with the communities that you serve. Across those two disciplines, we discovered, which was nothing that we're surprised of, that the people that are working in the communities don't necessarily live or grow up in those communities. And so it's really important to teach those professionals how to engage and to learn and to build those relationships with those communities. The top 3 reporters of child welfare is law enforcement, educators, and public health. And in many marginalized communities, there are not health clinics or professionals. I have also partnered with healthcare agencies to provide training and also tools for community engagement, community building, and then evaluating their internal policies, all the way to hiring, all the way to who are you hiring to do this work, to avoid tokenism and the standard working people of color on the front line, less paid. So we're looking at wage gaps. We're looking at all of the things. I have also trained community. That community is near and dear to my heart because, as you said, community rescued me. The community saved my life. And so it's something that I have always provided at no cost to families, to faith-based communities, to neighborhood centers, people that are living the life with the communities that they serve.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you're doing this work, it's giving people like skills and tools. What is the impact that you're hoping to have? Because like I know it's not just like decrease suspension rates, decrease rates of incarceration. Like we're measuring, hoping for things more deeper than that. That was a terrible way of saying that, but you get what I'm saying.
I do. And you're exactly right. Decreasing mass incarceration is great. But is it really a restorative and transformative solution? Or is decreasing mass incarceration that result in increased mental health, substance abuse engagement, sobriety, family counseling, education opportunities, housing improvement, work opportunities? To me, that's the measurement, is not just the decrease of the impacts of the system, but the increase of the success of the community.
Yeah, you were talking about what a measure for a white family with generational wealth. Like, we're not trying to get necessarily to that. Like, what are you trying to get people to? What are the measures that you're looking for?
The measures for individual families, looking at parents and then looking at their children. Parents not having to work 60 hours plus in frontline work, putting their health at risk considering today's pandemic, but having equal pay, which would be available to families if we shifted internal policy, right? And because with shifting internal policies in business, you're looking at opportunities for promotion, but you're also looking at job requirements. If every job requires a master's degree, then we know that chances are our cousin around the corner or our field down the street is not going to have a master's degree and will never be eligible for that promotion. And so I believe it starts with the workforce. I can't really say that because it starts with education.
Well, it's multiple.
It's multiple.
Yeah, multiple places. This work is needed everywhere. Sure.
Yeah. And so for the parents, just having equal opportunities, bridging those wage gaps, opportunity to return back to school or have access to trade education and trainings, and then benefits, health benefits, PTO, where they're not penalized if they have to take off of work to take care of their families, and then measuring success with youth and children by again having access to education, and I'm not just talking about the standard public education. I'm referring to college prep. I'm referring to teaching our children in ways that they'll learn, being creative, thinking outside of the box, listening and learning from the students as well. I think one of the standard teaching barriers that I've seen, because I've worked really closely with schools as well, is this is the way I teach. Take notes, and if you don't get it, go to tutoring, and I think that puts a stigma on someone's learning, and then they're classified as 504, or they're classified as having a learning disability, when in all reality they just need creative learning. And then also access to mental health. Again, with the pandemic, I've seen so many youth impacted by isolation and the gap in engaging, in social activities and sports and whatnot. So I have seen an increase within youth in the communities um, for suicidal ideations or substance abuse or depression. So I really think as we think about youth, creativity has to be at the forefront of how we're connecting with them.
Yeah, I think a lot about how it's not about like the absence of violence, but like the presence of life. So many people talk about. I think it's Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Like we're not just talking about like abolishing the prison industrial complex and policing. Right? What are the things that we're building that give life? And some of the things that you're talking about. What are the services that we're providing, but also making it accessible, right, to allow people to thrive are so key. You've done this across so many organizations over the years, whether it is being frontline on the ground with people. But now, like, just as I was scrolling through your LinkedIn, and I didn't know this when I asked you to be on this podcast, you are now a senior consultant at Mission Capital. How do you bring restorative practices into that role?
Well, the trick is that it's in everything I do.
Mm-hmm.
I facilitating conversations is one of the key fundamentals of restorative practices, is learning how to co-create safe spaces. And in my role at Mission Capital, I have the opportunity to work with child welfare providers and judges, attorneys, provide DVSA, domestic violence, sexual assault providers, foster providers, community educators. I mean, there are so many multidisciplinary levels of engagement, and one of the first things that I'll do is create community guidelines in conversations. And that's something that is very new, even in equity spaces. I am on the Central Health Equity Policy Council, and the whole goal is to achieve equity, yet how it's being achieved in an equitable manner is always the challenge. And so I create community guidelines, and I implement both components, the relational agreements and the structural agreements. And I do it in that order because prior to, if we look at the systems that exist without RJ, a touch of RJ, a system is created and then we're all told get along while doing it. or there's policy, right, about conduct or misconduct. And so systemically, it's done the other way around. Through RJ, relationship is centered first, then structure. So we evaluate how everyone comes into that space, what systemic racism you have encountered, and how it has impacted you, because that space is so diverse, with every race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation that exists. And so we all bring stuff with us. And when we're able to unpack that and say, this is what makes me, this is what my values are, this is what makes me feel strong, this is what how I respond when I feel that my values have been violated. Now we're also uncovering trauma, right? And we're uncovering triggers and responses at the same time. So it's a parallel process. And then we can go into structure. Okay, so now that we consider all that we come into this space with, how do we co-design a structure that feels safe to everyone? And so we build the process together. So it's all about inclusion. It is all about equity, and it is all about acknowledging the diversity in the space.
Yeah, I mean, and celebrating really, like, not just like, oh, you're a brown face, you're a black face, you're a queer body, you're a disabled body, but it's like, no, we want your perspective to help shape what we're doing. And I think, a lot of times people are just saying like, what are the policies that we need that will fix everything, right? Like, and if you're like if you top down hierarchically implement those policies, like, you're still alienating those people. You're not taking advantage of their experiences, because they're the people who are, going to be most impacted by this. That's such a great connection to make, where, you make similar. Just one, I think there's this acknowledgement that schools are also workplaces, where this is also really key. But, we have a lot of people who are educators and working in classrooms who listen to this, and the same thing in your classroom, right? You can set down rules that you think will best serve the space, but like, that might not be what all the little humans in your space need and want. So like, that co-design of that is so helpful. And when you've co-designed things, right, it's so much easier to restore back to what you've agreed on, rather than saying like, you broke my rule. It's like, hey, you're not upholding the agreement that you helped co-construct. So what is the thing that we need to do in order to get back in right relationship? Not like fix what you did, like, because there's no going back, but like, how do we get back in right relationship? How do we support community? And I think so much of that is continual community building, like you were talking about, happened in your life, and in so many other spaces that you've helped construct.
I agree. And when I worked with teachers and educators, that was one of the errors of the way that I saw happen often, is this process would be implemented, and the movement, and the teachers would get so fired up and they love doing this. And then I would see the shift where there's we all kind of retract back to our bad habits, right? Like, oh, I was exercising every day, and then I missed a day, and then it turned into 3, and then 5, and before you know, you haven't worked out in months, right? And well, at least that's my story. And
I feel you.
Well, I would see teachers start saying, okay, we're going to circle up today. I want to talk about respect, because I've noticed in the halls X, Y, and Z, or I've noticed, in the cafeteria, or there's been a lot of, talking without turn in the classroom. And so I would say, whoa, don't do that. We don't get to implement the topic of the conversation. If we're going to co-design the process, then we need to co-lead the process as well, which then means, if that's what you're noticing today, that's what you as an individual bring into that circle. But as far as the topic goes, we have to maintain true to what we agreed on and the fidelity of the work to say, okay, what does the whole class want to talk about this week in circle? And there may be a fight stirring up that the students know about, but yet you're worried about running in the halls. Like, we have to be able to still create space where everybody's bringing what's important and not shift that power back to ourselves and
Right.
take it away from the others.
And not just talking about, and not just using circles when like something is wrong, when someone did something bad, right? Like, how are we like proactively using circles and other practices to build relationships, so it's not just this thing like, oh, something's wrong, so and so is in trouble and now we need to fix it, right? There's
Yes.
so many things. One of the other things that just came to mind is thinking about how when you are bringing this work into schools and asking teachers to do that, like, it's a shift in power. You talked about that, from the very beginning of our conversation, and it might have been in the part that we weren't recording, but like how this is about, getting leveling the playing field, leveling the power. We're not, I don't know that I've actually said this on these airwaves yet, but like, we're not trying to create like more compassionate overlords. We're trying, both in businesses, in workplaces, and also in classrooms, also in the criminal legal system. But that's a whole other thing that I'm not going to try to touch right now. We're not trying to create a more compassionate system of oppression. We're
Right.
trying to create something new that allows equal participation, right? It's not that
Yes.
we're asking people to give up their power and become powerless. It's asking people to give up power, right? Giving up domination and holding power alongside all the other people in the space.
Absolutely. And the more that I have seen shared power, the more success, and long-term success, right? No, I don't think anybody wants a life's work to result in a short-term, um, measure of success. I think of that as that dud, right? That one firework that just went like pew, and then died, like, right? It just like fizzled out versus like the whole grand finale. And I think that when people share power, you're acknowledging the value of the other person that you're sharing power with. You're acknowledging who they are. You're acknowledging what makes them tick, what they believe, what makes them sad, what makes them happy, what makes them successful. With educators, we saw an increase in attendance. We saw a rise in grades. We saw an increase in participation in sports. We saw parental increase. Now you had parents responding because they didn't feel like you were out to get them. With law enforcement, I facilitated conversations after the George Floyd murder with community and law enforcement. And through that, there were law enforcement officers that felt supported enough to use their voice within their system to say, this is how I feel we can make this more equitable, or I apologize for how someone else in the system responded, but this is how I want to respond. And community also said, I hated you, but I didn't know you were, a cool dude or whatever. And then when we've implemented with criminal, there were one example was there were two young men who had been drinking and driving and ran a red light and severely injured someone else in the family of that other person. They were on life support and everything, and these two young men, they were young, and they were looking at a lifetime in prison. And through using the restorative process with them, this other family says, I don't want you to lose your life. I want you to do something with it. And if you do these things, we can work together. And they went back to school, and they were provided free service for them and their family for mental health and for substance abuse. They both have their own little families today. We have helped people with DWIs get into rehab, and who are productive members of the community. We've used it in child welfare and family violence and domestic violence cases, which is one of the top reasons why families who encounter violence and abuse end up with a child welfare case. I often say all roads lead to child welfare because of mandatory reporting. And so we were able to achieve 70% family preservation. That's 70% of those families who got to stay together and get help rather than to be separated and become a part of another system or multiple systems, because we also know the outcome of children who are separated from their families end up with juvenile cases of their own, and then potentially adult cases. And so it's just that ripple effect. And so if we use restorative practices like as the framework that it is meant to be, which is to empower ourselves and the community around us, to equalize and to share power, values, and to govern our own communities, then we'll see the outcomes that are true to us without colonizing what those outcomes are perceived to be by the world that we live in today.
Beautiful. I want to share with folks, you've shared in other spaces about, that work specifically with survivors of domestic abuse. I want to plug the Partnered with a Survivor podcast. You were featured on episode 20. So if people want to explore more of your work with that specifically, invite them to check that out. We'll link that in the show notes. You also just gave a beautiful framework for what restorative justice is, and that's often the question that I transition into, like the questions that I ask everyone. So we're going to continue to do that. This podcast is brought to you in part by a generous grant from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. NACRJ promotes effective forms of justice that are equitable, sustainable, and socially constructive by providing a professional association for educators, practitioners, and others interested in restorative and community justice. The primary means to fulfill this mission are their membership accessible website and biannual conference. This year, the conference is July 7 through 9 in Chicago. As a two-time conference attendee and a former Chicago resident, I'm super excited to be joining the conference this year to connect with RJ practitioners all across the world. You can save over $100 on conference registration by signing up with Amplify RJ's group registration at the link in the show notes. You can learn more about NACRJ and membership at nacrj.org. And I'm going to ask, what's been like an oh shit moment in this work, and what did you learn from it?
Oh gosh. I think my first oh shit moment was when I realized that I had strayed from this being living in my heart, and it shifted into my head. And that's, I think, where we can easily become performative. And that's when I was just like you said, like, oh shit, yeah. Like, how did I get here? Like, I'm in the middle of the ocean. Like, where's my paddle? I need to get back. And I think the other oh shit moment, after the Ferguson murder,
of Mike Brown.
There were protests around the world, and there was a stir of anger and protesting that was happening here in Austin. The police department had been shot up. There were bullet holes in the police department. Things were unraveling quickly, and then someone threw in restorative justice, and that word started buzzing around, and I'm very protective of the work, because there can be a malpractice of RJ, right?
Yeah.
and and when that happens and it's used in an unproductive way, then it hurts the whole community. And then I see professionals who are engaging pull back and and question whether or not restorative justice is real and impactful. And so I said, oh, like, oh my God, okay. We were called out and they said, we want restorative justice, and it became a part of the chant. And I'll never forget, um we went out there. We were in front of the police station. We're on the steps, and there's thousands of people out there, the and we're talking to people, and we're talking to the organizers, and we're trying to like help to bring some understanding about what restorative justice is and how we can use restorative justice in this um, in this in this tragic situation to bring awareness and change in our own city. And while we're there, all the cameras turned and the mic is put in my hand, and I was like, oh shit. I have to tell all these thousands of people that what they've been told about restorative justice is not this. And, and, and so I just remember, um, just all I could share was the truth about what RJ is and what it's done for me, and how it can be used as a tool and as a way of life for all key stakeholders, which are from the courthouses to the streets, to build safer and healthier communities. And I wasn't prepared to do that, so it was a big it was a big moment. But that's when I knew that I was back to the root of the process, and that it was living in my heart and not in my head. And it wasn't something I had to plan and write notes and do all of that. Um, but we saw a positive outcome of that. And we still have seen positive outcomes. Our district attorney is creating a restorative justice committee to help shape and to restructure and co-design what public safety. We've had a campaign here for reimagining public safety, and that's one of the responses to it. We're reimagining child welfare. We're reimagining and co-designing in every corner that you can turn to. Um, but the oh shit moments were probably when I thought I knew what I was like gonna do, and then was just caught off guard or by surprise. But that's what oh shit is about, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's something about like two distinct moments, right? Where like one's like, let me get back on track, but like always be ready, always be ready. You never know when this work is gonna be needed or when you're gonna need to share about this work. Um, you've you get to sit in circle with four people, living or dead. Who are they, and what question do you ask the circle?
Wow. Four people sitting in circle, living or dead. Hands down, Martin Luther King. Selfishly, I would say my mom, because she's no longer with us. Third, I'd say Rosa Parks. And fourth would be a great, great, great grandparent or ancestor from my indigenous lineage, from the indigenous lineage that I come from.
What's the question you asked the circle?
I would ask, what kept you going when you got tired and wanted to quit?
What keeps you going when you get tired?
The work isn't finished yet.
If I was to answer that question, you know, my future children, right? And the world that they're going to live in.
Mm.
I've asked this question in a couple different ways. What is one specific place or situation that you've witnessed recently that you wish people knew this work?
A situation like that, you'd probably think I'm crazy for saying this, would be the insurrection. There were law enforcement officers that felt scared and harmed. There were lives lost. There were cabinet members that hid and cried. There were people that were angry and desperate to show their actions louder than words. And I wish that there would be an opportunity to implement RJ work, lots of prep work, lots of mini circles, resulting in the opportunity for those that have been harmed to share how that day impacted them and their families. And my greatest hope is always that the person that caused harm would come to a realization of their actions and make an attempt to make things right.
Yeah, it's funny. I was recording this podcast on January 6th with Kate Pranis when it happened.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And and it's so interesting to think about, like, one, the logistical barriers to doing that, with the criminal legal system being what it is, like where people are really incentivized not to admit the harm that they've caused, right? And the polarization that exists within our country, and the quote unquote cancel culture, which I do think is real, where it's like, these people are trash, they can't be redeemed, right? We have to throw them away, lock them up indefinitely. We can't move through the world like that. The logical conclusion of that is, like, I don't know if it's like genocide, but it's like political party side, right? Yeah. And that just continues, like, cycles of harm.
Yeah. And I don't, and I cannot honestly say I don't do this work and hope that someone will, you don't ever have to confess to me or in the space. But if you're in the space, my hope is that you'll at least hear the impact of what you've done, and that you'll process that internally in a way that you don't escape yourself, right? We may escape systems, or we may escape people with certain privileges, may escape penalties and things like that, right? Like, but you'll never be able to escape yourself. You wake up with yourself, you go to bed with yourself, and to process that internally and change that internally is enough. I don't have to see it. And it probably stems from my life, right? Like, is that there are people that will never see or know what I do or who I am today. They'll only remember me for who I was back then. And if it were up to a lot of people, I would have been thrown away. And I guess for me, I'm I'm thankful that I wasn't, and I've had the opportunity to make a lot of wrongs right. And as far as the criminal system, I think that would be the win, right? Is that they would participate in it. And I don't know, I don't know, David, I'm a crazy believer that if we had the right conversation with the right people, that it could happen. I believe in the impossible, probably because I've survived the impossible, and I've lived through a lot of the impossible, and it just doesn't make sense. Um, but I would hope that if that circle or that process would happen, that it would be modeled to the world that anything is possible, and that we can make wrongs right, no matter how far in we are, how gone, how lost a person is, that everyone deserves the opportunity to make a wrong right.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. This wasn't planned, and it occurred to me now. You don't have to answer this question. When you think about your ex, right, and the immense amount of harm that he caused you, your kids, what is your hope for his restoration?
I feel like I've gotten it. Um, One of the things that I have worked really hard to shift in that field is to ask survivors, what does justice look like to you? Which was the part of the topic of the other podcast. I had hoped, and he spent majority of his life in prison and is out now. And I had hoped for that inward work and processing to help him to understand the impact that he had on myself, on his children, and on others. I have had the opportunity to share my voice, and to be able to say the things that I needed to say, and encourage him to seek help for his mental health and sobriety, which he's done. And he has been out of prison now for about 2 years. And he is, in the last maybe 6 months, my kids, adult kids now, finally allowed him into their life, and he is an active part of their life now. And he's a safe, active part of their life. And so I feel like I have seen the restorative process in full force in my life, from in every age and every stage of my long, difficult, complex, wonderful, amazing, unpredictable life. And I have had the opportunity to remarry, and um, I have a husband who listens, um, and adores me, and my children and our grandchildren, and so I feel restored, and I feel that my children have also had the opportunity to achieve restoration in their life, physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, by support of community, resources, you name it. They're thriving, and doing great things, and they're amazing parents that are breaking the cycle of generational violence and abuse.
I kind of want to end it there, but I still have like a couple more questions, and they're
Go
they're
ahead.
pretty quick. Um, but really, thank you for sharing that. What is one mantra or affirmation that you want to leave everyone here listening with?
My mantra is someone did it for me. And my prayer is that you will do it for someone else. Affirmation or word of encouragement for everyone listening is don't allow anyone to throw you away. Don't allow anyone to silence you or disqualify you or make you feel less than the amazing and resilient person that you are. Whether you are the person that experienced harm or the person that caused harm, I do not believe that it is within our right to throw people away. And so don't give up and don't throw yourself away. I think through the process, my biggest challenge was forgiving myself for all of the things that I was a part of or I felt I allowed to happen. And so I challenge you to do the internal work, to process your harm, to reach out for help, to let others help you, process internalized oppression, and really assess your strengths and the things that you do well, and to start there.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I've been processing that just as you've been speaking. Last two questions. Who's someone that I should have on this podcast? And you have to help me get them on.
Oh, who is someone you should have on this podcast? Ooh, one of my my sisters out there. We are we're pretty close and we've shared a lot of opportunities with each other. Her name is Denise Holiday, and she goes by Circle Mama, and she works for National Education of Restorative Discipline. And her and I have worked side by side with education, law enforcement, community implementation, and other opportunities. And yes, I would gladly connect you with her.
Hey, love it. And finally, how can people support your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
How can people support my work? Well, I will be, I'm a co-author of a book, Restorative Discipline Practices. And so purchasing or reading this book, sharing it with community or professionals. I'm in the process of writing another book that will help people to understand that this is a multidisciplinary framework, and not just, as you said in the beginning, for educators or law or criminal systems. Follow our page. Our website is under construction, and we're revamping. We'll be putting some videos out there and some tools to help people to develop guidelines and framework training opportunities.
Sorry, which page?
Be the change tools.
Okay, be the change tools. Perfect. And just looking, I saw the book cover, but I didn't realize. Shout out Dr. Gay Lang, who has also been a guest on this podcast, and I was a guest on hers, and we aired that I think a couple weeks ago. So shout out, full circle, all the fields. Well, thank you so much for being here. It really was an honor to be a part of, sharing your story with the world, with the hundreds, hopefully future thousands and millions of people who listen to this podcast. Anything else you want to leave the people with?
I just encourage you to follow David. Follow Amplify RJ. I had the opportunity to listen in on some of the podcasts that you've been able to do, and I'm impressed with the research on the guests that you bring, and I just this is a very humble feeling and platform. So follow David, You might learn a thing or two. Who knows?
Hey.
You may become a great practitioner one day as a guest on this show.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much for everyone who's listened this week. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care.
Elise here. Thank you so much, Eloise, for all you had to offer this episode. Despite all the difficult challenges that Eloise has faced in her life, she really capitalized on the idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self. Another layer to the idea of forgiveness that she presented was, in order to right a wrong, you sometimes need outside support. All it takes is for one person to believe in you and tell you that you are valuable. One of my favorite quotes from this episode is, "Don't throw yourself away, and don't allow anyone to throw you away." How do you show love to yourself? And how do you earn forgiveness from yourself? Thank you as always for listening, and don't forget to check out all of the links in the show notes below to support Eloise and Amplify RJ. And with that, I'll see you all next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.